I think that I finally come around on Man of Steel. I know, this is a shocking turn of events if you've been a long-time supporter of my channel. And if you're just finding my channel because of this video, let me explain. One of the first videos on my channel ever was a video about Man of Steel. That video though, yeah, it's not good, but hey, growing pains. Since then, I went on to slowly throw jabs at Man of Steel as an ongoing joke because my opinion on Zack Snyder's Man of Steel is something that I've historically been criticized about. Well, I finally rewatched this movie, and well, I don't think that I hate it anymore. Man of Steel, at best, is an enjoyable movie that never fully meets its potential. Despite its flaws, I actually do like this movie now. You see, when I made my last video, I missed a lot of the points that Man of Steel was trying to get across, whether it was the placement of flashbacks, a few moments in the movie, such as Clark's dad's sacrifice, or even certain lines. A lot of those things work so much better than I remember. The reason why Man of Steel never fully meets its potential though is because there are a lot of things that could have been cleaned up to create a better overall movie, or at least create a better experience for the viewer. To give a primary example of this, I really like the beginning of Man of Steel. It does such a fantastic job at setting up the problems with Krypton and explaining why Krypton was falling without boring the viewer. A large part of that is because the back and forth between Jor-El and Zod is thoroughly interesting to watch. There's a certain level of synergy that Michael Shannon and Russell Crowe have on screen together that makes you care about the overall stakes in those moments, even if you know that no matter what, this ends up with Clark going to Earth and becoming Superman. However, I don't think that this opening act should have stayed past 15 minutes long because honestly, it heavily overstays its welcome. And I know, a lot of people would say, well, the opening act needs to tie up loose ends for Zod and Lara, but like, does it really? By that point in time, we've been told multiple times that Krypton is doomed/dead, which makes it easy for us to accept an off-screen death for Lara, plus we rarely spend time with her, so it's not like people would think about what happened to her. As for Zod, I would have preferred a Zack Snyder ended Zod's opening arc sooner. The core reason is that if Zack Snyder used a specific shot where Zod is accepting getting arrested for his crimes as the ending to Zod's part in the opening act, it would have allowed the viewer to sort of forget about Zod, which would have made his re-emergence later on in the movie far more impactful. Of course, this brings me to probably the most frustrating thing about Man of Steel, Superman. By that I mean Zack Snyder had a good train of thought with his ideals for Superman, but they could have been better. The last time I watched this movie, which for reference was 2 years ago, I distinctly remember not being a fan of this iteration of Superman. I figured out why that was the case. It's because Zack Snyder's take on Superman isn't as lovable as he could be. Clark feels like a fish out of water in every scene. And before you get on my case, hear me out for a second. I fully realize that Clark giving off the whole "a fish out of water" feeling is clearly intentional, considering this movie makes such a big emphasis on him having to learn how to become the bridge between humans and aliens. My problem is that this creative decision does more harm than good. Unlike most people, I'm okay with directors straying away from the source material and trying to put their twist on things. Whether that ends up being good or not is a different story, but I like the idea of encouraging people to use their creativity to put a twist on things. In the case of Man of Steel, Zack Snyder's creativity fails to meet its potential more so than it succeeds. You see, I don't need Clark to be the Boy Scout or the goody two-shoes like he is in Superman Returns. No shade to Superman Returns, considering I do like that movie. If you're interested in my opinion, by the way, you can learn more about it in my Superman Returns video. It's just that Clark Kent in Man of Steel could have been such a stronger character instead of us having to wait for Batman v Superman and eventually Zack Snyder's Justice League to do this Superman actual justice, pun intended. For instance, I like that Clark Kent is a complicated character in Man of Steel who has to find himself because he's being pulled in multiple directions due to a multitude of reasons. A majority of my favorite moments in Man of Steel are the moments where Clark is figuring out who he is, or when the movie is connecting a present moment to a flashback to further explain who Clark is. is. The problem though is that this specific angle in this movie makes it hard for the viewer to relate to this Superman and his ideals, or at least it's hard to like Clark in this movie unlike in the other two movies he's in. A big reason is that this movie spends so much time on Clark trying to find himself and find his actual purpose because he's being pulled in so many different directions. So rather than feeling like a protagonist who has actual depth, Clark comes off as a difficult, one-note character who doesn't know who he is until the very end of the movie, which kind of sucks if you ask me. And it sucks even further if you compare Man of Steel to another movie like Wonder Woman. Before you get on my case, yes, I'm more than aware that Wonder Woman came out after Man of Steel, which means it had a chance to learn from Man of Steel's mistakes. Just hear me out. Wonder Woman isn't too far off from Man of Steel. The movie establishes Diana as this fierce warrior. She then becomes a fish out of water because she's taken out of her comfort zone as she journeys to find Ares with Steve Trevor, and along the way, she grows a lot. Diana's journey ultimately grows her in a way that makes us appreciate her character as a whole. She goes from this super serious Amazonian warrior to becoming this outstanding, loving person who fights with all her heart for the things she loves. The good, the bad, and the emotional aspects of her journey warm us up to Diana and make us love her by the end of Wonder Woman because of what she overcomes by the time she finally comes face to face with Ares. And that's because Wonder Woman utilizes something that Man of Steel doesn't. The small memorable moments that ultimately add up over time and help give our protagonist depth. Does Man of Steel have good moments that make us warm up to Clark? Of course. Now, does Man of Steel have the emotional moments needed to give Clark depth? Yes, but not enough. The only real emotional moment for Clark in this movie happens because of Zod and his plan to get rid of Earth for the sake of finally rebuilding Krypton again. Zod and his plan, which he doesn't plan on stopping unless he stopped, give Clark this pivotal moment that forces Clark to finally let out all of his pain. Clark reluctantly killing Zod, although he probably could have gone with another way of saving the day, I digress, is arguably the only moment where we finally get to really feel something for Clark and finally feel sympathetic towards Clark. I guess what I'm trying to say as a whole is that I just wish Man of Steel had more of this so we didn't have to wait for Clark's appearance in other movies to care about him, let alone actually like him. Honestly, I feel like it's a shame that this is the case considering there's someone in this movie that could have specifically fixed this flaw, Lois Lane. If we're all being honest with ourselves, Lois Lane is completely underutilized in this movie. Her whole purpose in this movie is to be a plot device that motivates Clark to realize who he has to become towards the end of the movie. The Codex version of Jor-El uses Lois and risks her potentially dying just to show Clark how he could become the bridge between aliens and the people of Earth. If you ask me, not only is that a massive gamble, but it's kind of dumb as well. It's even weirder when you realize that this is also the same character who plays a massive role in Zack Snyder's Justice League, and by then they've seldom had chemistry building moments. If Lois was more than just a reporter trying to tell her story of meeting Clark, along with being a plot device, there could have been something special about their dynamic and future relationship. Think about it. There should have been at least a handful of intimate chemistry building moments between her and Clark outside of Clark putting her through a ton of pain as he heals her injury that could have led to something like Trevor and Diana's heartwarming dynamic in Wonder Woman. It would have given Clark a bit more growth and almost humanized him in a way that gives Clark the emotional depth to make him feel far less cold than he actually is. On a much more positive sounding note, can we all agree on two things, with the first thing being that Man of Steel's visual effects have aged gracefully? Zack Snyder deserves so much credit for his creative direction with his visual effects, whether it's Clark's first flight, Clark saving the oil rig, or the 30-minute back and forth final fight. The visual effects are still amazing. One of my favorite aspects of the visual effects is that somehow Henry Cavill doesn't feel human in this movie. Every time he punches, flies, or does anything related to Clark using his powers, feels like it has actual weight to it and that it has an actual impact. I will say though that there's only one clear shot with visual effects that didn't age well in my opinion, and it's probably something most people would not care about. I mean, look, the fire just looks like it's kind of there, all right? It's not amazing, but it's not downright terrible. It's just there. And that scene doesn't stay long enough for people to have a visceral reaction or anything, but it was probably the only moment where I had a bit of an oof. That could have been better reaction. If you really wanted to fix that one single shot, a little back and forth between Clark and those guys on the boat would be a simple fix. A little, doesn't that fire bother you? And then Clark shaking it off or being like, oh right, there's fire on me, and him brushing it off could have fixed the mediocre fire effects. But as I said, it's not that big of a deal. The point is that Zack Snyder was genuinely on a different level with Man of Steel's visual effects direction. It's insane when you think about the fact that it's been 9 years since this movie came out, and yet the visual effects have held up till this day. I'd almost argue that Man of Steel has some of the best visual effects we've ever seen in a superhero movie. Although that's an argument or discussion for another day, or better yet, another video. Now, despite loving Man of Steel's visual effects, I'm just gonna be honest with you guys and admit the truth. I don't entirely love the 30-minute visual effects highlight reel that is the ending of this movie. Do you want to know why? Zack Snyder's Man of Steel, throughout its entirety and despite its flaws, feels like a tightly crafted movie. It's a movie that requires a lot of patience as it is building towards a pivotal moment, which is Zod's reemergence on Earth. But when the final section of this movie comes, it doesn't hit me the way it might hit other people. For reference, it's not even that I don't find the last 30 minutes of this movie, which as I said is a visual effects highlight reel, to not be entertaining. It's that I found myself beginning to slowly become disconnected from all of this massive destruction. It's fun, it's action-packed, it's chaotic, and there's so much going on, but it's almost too much going on, which makes it feel like there's too much noise in a way. I fully understand that it's supposed to be the payoff for this movie's lack of action, considering there's so much setup for it, but I almost feel like Zack Snyder could have cut some of it out to make it feel as tight-knit as the rest of Man of Steel. That way, it feels less like it's trying to overcompensate, at least in my eyes, and more like, here, this is what you've been waiting for this entire time. Your mind is about to be blown because of this perfectly crafted and long overdue final throwdown between Zod and Superman. Speaking of which, that brings me to the second thing I hope we can all agree upon. Michael Shannon's Zod is so damn good. While he might not share a ton of screen time with Clark, that back and forth between evil and good is so incredibly interesting. I love how Zod explains his long-term plan to Clark, mostly because the visuals remind me so much of Bloodborne, if I'm being honest. The point is that I love how Zod's persistence and willingness to fight to the death for the sake of trying to see his plan through brings out the good in Clark. From the moment Clark learns of these plans, Clark immediately takes all of the lessons that he's learned from the beginning of the movie to bring a stop to Zod's madness without any hesitation. Even though, you know, it causes a massive amount of destruction that immediately pisses off Bruce Wayne later on in Batman v Superman. One of my favorite aspects though is the sheer presence that Michael Shannon brings to Zod. There isn't a moment where Zod's ideals or motives aren't believable. You do believe that Zod is going to do anything to make his plans come true, and that's because of how good of an actor Michael Shannon is. That's not even the best part about Zod here. It's the effect that Zod's death had on Superman. Despite his victory against Zod, Clark isn't happy with him having to kill Zod to bring an end to his madness. He isn't happy or even relieved like most protagonists would be at that moment. If anything, Zod's death brought him even more pain. That moment for me is when Clark's emotional depth finally comes to light. All of those moments of him figuring himself out and flashbacks that highlight the lessons that Clark needed to learn to be the best hero he can be finally paid off at that moment. That moment right there is when I finally began to realize that I actually like Man of Steel. Look, I know that a majority of this video comes off as negative, but that's not the intended purpose by any means. Beyond course correcting my opinion and giving Man of Steel a much better video, the meaning behind this piece is to highlight something. As someone who previously hated Man of Steel, I've finally grown to realize the things I originally glossed over and failed to truly understand. Man of Steel isn't perfect. It's a flawed movie and it's not for everyone by any means at all. However, what I can say though is that I don't hate Man of Steel anymore. I don't. After this recent rewatch, I couldn't help but wish all of the things that I've discussed throughout this video were a little different because there was so much potential for this movie. This truly could have been something so much better had Zack Snyder gone about some of his creative ideas differently or gotten others to help rein in his creativity. At the end of the day, Man of Steel is a fun superhero movie with outstanding visual effects that have aged gracefully. While it's not perfect in the storytelling department and not perfect when it comes to its characterization of Clark Kent, I found a new appreciation for a movie I once hated. And you know what? That's perfectly okay with me because we still have Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice Ultimate Edition, and Zack Snyder's Justice League, which were both better than Man of Steel and do this iteration of Clark Kent far more justice. Plus, we have the original Superman movies, Superman Returns, the CW's Crisis on Infinite Earths event, and Superman and Lois that also help fill in the gap for those who want a different characterization of Superman. I'm just relieved that I can finally say that I don't hate Man of Steel anymore. I just wish that it was better.